I was asked to talk about NRCS's new soil carbon amendment practice standard today, and it's one that I had a lot to do with. So just to start off, if you're unfamiliar with NRCS or what we mean by practices, we have these standards that we use, and they're supporting practices. And what we use these for is to treat resource concerns. And so you can think of these as problems on the landscape that need to be addressed or fixed. Right now, the agency has 47 resource concerns. Some of the newer ones, or the ones that are most relevant to me, I am in the soil health division with NRCS. We have 4 of the main soil health resource concerns, which would be organic matter depletion, compaction. Those have been around for a long time and are things that most people know about. And then some new ones that just came on are aggregate instability, or the ability of the soil particles to stick together or fall apart in water. And then soil organism habitat loss or degradation. And so that last one's a mouthful, but it's probably one of the most important ones, because really when you think about soil and soil health, it really should be focused on soil biology, because those are really the drivers in the soil. Things that we do in the agency, we provide both technical and financial assistance in support of these conservation practices to treat these resource concerns. So we do both, and oftentimes, after going through an application process, producers can get the technical and financial assistance bundled within their state. So we have regular practices, and then we also have interim practices. And these are really used to evaluate what we call new conservation technology. But if you think about it, biochar and other things like compost amendment, they're not necessarily new. What is new is how they fit within NRCS and the planning process. So that's kind of what we mean about this. And then, biochar is new in the fact that we know so much new things about, or so many new things about it right now, that we need to figure out how to incorporate that science into how we plan. Interim practices generally go for a 3-year period. And then at the end of that 3-year period, if we think that they are appropriate and the chief thinks it's appropriate, we will have them become a new practice within the agency. So interim practices right now, it's up to the states to figure out if they want to adopt an interim or not. The state conservationists for NRCS, they have a state technical committee that provides them input and recommendations on the adoption of practices. And so that's really up to each state, and I'll point that out a bit later. So when it comes to soil health, we know that in general, improved soil organic carbon or organic matter tend to lead to more improved soil health and the ability of the soil to function. There are many ways to improve soil health. Shown on the right here is what we call the 4 principles of soil health, right? Minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover on the right in order to protect soil aggregates and organism habitat. And then on the left, maximizing living roots and maximizing biodiversity in order to feed soil biology. So those are our 4 principles, and they're long-term management objectives. And one of the things when it comes to soil health is we realize that there's really no silver bullets. Senator Angus King in Maine actually said there's no silver bullets, there's just silver buckshot. And I tend to agree with that. There's no real one way to improve soil health. Oftentimes you have to continue to adapt, monitor, and evaluate your management practices. However, I think this group knows that there are ways to improve soil health in the short term. And I refer to these as soil conditioners, which I would include compost and biochar as soil conditioners, as a way to achieve shorter term gains and actually long-term gains in soil health. And I probably didn't need to have the slide in here because most of the participants today probably are much more familiar with the research on biochar than the average person. But what we do is when we're creating an interim practice standard, we consult the scientific literature, and then we try to figure out how to link what has been found as proven science, and we try to link those with our resource concerns. So you can see, just from a couple articles alone, we can see that biochar tends to improve aggregate stability. So right away, we know that would hit on our aggregate instability resource concern. And then, there's obvious benefits of using biochar to reduce nitrogen leaching, reduce bulk density. And so there's a whole host of benefits. And so we try to integrate those benefits into our practice standards. So soil carbon amendment was introduced a little over a year ago. I wrote the initial standard, even though interims are introduced by states. We wrote one a little over a year ago, then we revised it again this past summer. And the definition for this practice standard is to use amendments derived from plant or animal residues to improve the properties of the soil, physical, chemical, and biological. And the way our standards are set up, the purposes actually relate back to our resource concerns that I talked about earlier, right? So improving organic matter, improving aggregate stability, organism habitat, et cetera. So we have 47 resource concerns. These are the ones that we chose to focus on. It does not mean that these are the only ones that we consider to be important. These are the focus for this year, actually. We had a number of states adopt the practice. And so right now you can see at the bottom there, we have right around 20 states and areas that have adopted 808 for the fiscal year 21 program cycle. So a little bit more about it. We also try to tell producers where they need to do this particular practice. So for this one, it's pretty wide open. It's to all land uses where organic carbon amendments are going to improve the conditions of the soil. We do have some exceptions in there. We don't want compost or biochar applied to fallow land, land that's not going to be farmed or used or have plants on it. And then we also have some exceptions in there for native grasslands. We want to make sure that any of the new nutrient interactions as a result of an amendment do not negatively affect the plant community in some of these grasslands. I mentioned primarily it's for biochar and compost, but there are others that are allowed. We do say for this standard, we want organic carbon sources only. So limestone, though it contains carbon, would not be considered an organic carbon source. And this year, we also prohibited the use of biosolids or sewage sludge for this particular standard. And we're asking that raw animal manure, that's generally a standard operation for farms, the spreading of raw animal manure. We'd ask that the manure be composted or made into biochar. And so this practice here focuses really on the spreading and improvement of the soil, not necessarily in the manufacture of the biochar or the compost. We also have a number of other carbon sources that are allowed as well. You can read those right there, but that's probably not that relevant to this group because we're here to talk about biochar. So just a bit on financial assistance through NRCS. And so it's a relatively intricate process to figure out how things actually make their way to producers and are incentivized for them. So typically we think of it as cost share, but it's not. It's really just financial assistance. What we do is we do look at real numbers for what we call average component costs. And some of those components here are shown on the bottom, like trucking and shipping, how many hours it takes you to apply the material, whether you have to till or not, if there's soil tests involved, and then the actual price of the biochar itself. So we use real numbers for this, and then we come up with what we call typical scenarios. So there's always winners and losers when you have a typical scenario. And as far as biochar is concerned, we have two right now that we have, and both of them involve the biochar to be imported. So at this point in time for 808, we're not providing financial assistance for on-farm production of biochar, but rather from imported material. And so we have one scenario that's 100% biochar, and then we have another one that's a mixture of compost and biochar. And so it's tricky figuring out how to provide a good payment rate for these particular materials because we can't just do it by the ton basis because, as I showed on the left, there's all these other components that go into the process, and we don't want to have 100 different scenarios. We want to keep it relatively brief. So We have two, 100% biochar, and we put a floor on this rather than a ceiling, and saying, all right, we'll provide payment on an acre basis for the spread biochar, and the minimum amount that you have to put on is either 1 ton per acre or 4 cubic yards per acre. And I know there are a lot of experts on the call here that would say that the conversion between tons and cubic yards is pretty suspect, I guess, depending on the moisture levels, even in the air. So that's our minimum. Then the other scenario we have is for a mixture of compost and biochar. And this one is, predominantly compost based, but we say you have to have at least 10% biochar in the mix, whether it's by weight or volume. And we put a floor on this as well and say that we'd like to see greater than 3 tons per acre or 6 cubic yards per acre of compost and biochar. And looking down here at the bottom left, you'll see, we do use real values. Biochar, we've consulted at least 4 or 5 sources. The sources have to be on the internet, and we have to have at least 3 of them. And so we've come up with this value, $190 per cubic yard, of what we consider to be the average cost for biochar. And then compost is on a ton basis. This has been in our payment system for a while, and that's roughly $50 per ton. This changes depending on what state you're in and what the cost of living is in your particular state as well. But anyways, so that's pretty intricate. There's a lot that goes on there, but I think you can get the general idea. For a regular biochar scenario, we're looking at approximately $800 per acre, including all the components in biochar, to apply biochar at a minimum of 4 cubic yards an acre. And then for the compost and biochar scenario, it's roughly $350 per acre. And again, that's just generalization. It can be more or less depending on the state that you're in. This is a really busy slide. I apologize for that, but I just wanted to talk about the practice standard itself for a second. So when we get into biochar, first off, we define biochar as being produced by heating biomass to more than 350 C under controlled or limited oxidant conditions. So I believe that's a relatively standard definition. Some have written in and said that they think 350 is too low, but anyways, I'm happy to take feedback on that, and I'll get back to feedback in a second here. Another thing is we're requiring reporting of the production of the biochar, and so we don't have any real sidebars on what can and cannot be used right now beyond what I mentioned earlier in terms of biosolids. But right now, we'd like to see what I think it's kind of what like the IBI has for their reporting requirements, where we're looking at the country of origin of the feedstock, the percent feedstock composition, how it's produced, and then looking at some of the elemental analysis and other characteristics such as carbon, nitrogen, pH, et cetera. So we'd like to have all that material so that we can incorporate it into the producer's nutrient budget as well. This last paragraph here is something that was causing, I guess it's in there because it was causing a lot of heartburn for a number of NRCS employees. They know that biochar can be produced from crop residues on fields, but we've spent decades trying to get producers to leave crop residue on the field, not only for erosion protection, but also for improving soil health. So we've kind of put this caveat in there that, well, the feedstock should not be made from crop residues that could otherwise be left on the field to provide protection. That's going to be a difficult one to really kind of track back and figure out. But I think as we go forward, this is an interim practice. And as we go forward, we can make things quite a bit better once we figure out what some of the issues are that we need to address. And then the second one, this came a lot from New England, but it was the idea that, we need to keep woody residue on the forest floor in order to, sustain forest health and wildlife habitat. So the idea here is that we make sure that our conservation planners are following the forest stand improvement practice standard. When it comes to monitoring and evaluation, because this is a practice that we are evaluating, we're asking our planners to do before and after assessments and tests. So we'll do an in-field, what we call an in-field qualitative assessment. So planners will go out with the producer and look at the condition of their field and make a note of that. And then we will also do a laboratory soil health test before and after as well. So we'll look at kind of the 5 factors that we have right now in NRCS for soil testing, looking at aggregate stability, respiration, bioavailable nitrogen, organic carbon, of course, and then active carbon, so that labile fraction of carbon that's available to soil organisms. So we'll do that before and then also provide follow-up testing. And so lastly, there's a lot of things, I've read about a lot of things that biochar can do that are positive. And so this one practice alone isn't, I think, representative of every agency process that biochar can be worked into. We know that there's other things like mixing biochar with manure for, to treat our resource concern of objectionable odors. So we have like a waste treatment practice where that could be used. And of course, as many presenters have already talked about, wildfire hazard, and as others have mentioned, the use of woody residue treatment. So that's in CSP as an enhancement, and then some states like Kansas also have this in their standard as a way to actually produce biochar from and prevent wildfire hazards. So with that, I will stop my presentation now. My email address is at the bottom. And I'll say we're actually going to be getting together a group of experts outside of NRCS to give another run at the practice standard to make sure that what we're doing and what we're recommending is right and scientifically defensible. So I guess I would say if you're an expert in this field, look for an email from me at some point.